Thank you for the kind introduction and all the warm welcome that I have been receiving in the last couple of days. Well, before I start my presentation, I think it's just good. I think it's going to be very interesting because we are going to put into dialogue and also it goes well against all that we have been hearing today regarding the global challenges, what Africa faces. Brazil is such an important part when we look at the agricultural sector, not only in production, but also when we look at the fertilizer sector as the fourth largest consumer in the world. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what has been done in Brazil so far, how we got to where we are today, and some challenges and opportunities that I think will go quite well along with what we've heard along the day. So with no further ado, Brazil has been increasing steadily its international presence in the commodities market, the food production international market in the last decade, if I dare say so. From 2013 onwards, we have been, as a country, the main exporters for soybeans, but we also rank quite high when we look at the production of orange juice, coffee, sugar, corn, and most important for some countries, animal protein as well. And alongside the production, we also are a major exporter and increasingly rank, especially after the pandemic, as one of the main exporters for the international system. In that case, I know that some partners have been mentioned, whereas when we look at the trade flow internationally, and I think it's very important to highlight when I mentioned that Brazil has a very significant role in international production and exports for soybeans, as an example. In 21, we produced over 90 million metric tons of soybeans, and the exports actually were around 85 to 90 million tons, and 70% of that went to China. When we look at the soy oil, we also see an interesting flow to Asia and the soy meals. We see also Asia, but we also start to look more at Europe as an example. And why is that important? Why did I bring these numbers specifically? I brought also the trade flow for Brazil when we look at fertilizer imports, specifically the nitrogen market. We can see that Russia, China, and also Northern Africa and Middle Eastern countries are very important exporters for fertilizers in Brazil. And when we look at the challenges that Brazil faces, when we put specifically it into logistics, this will have a significant impact because grains and fertilizers, they use basically the same vessels and also the same trucks that use the roads. It's basically they go out with grains and they come in with fertilizers. So this is also very important for the challenges that Brazil face as one of the countries that is so important for international trade, but also has its internal challenges when we look at its vast extension. And I'll talk a little bit about that. It has been mentioned also when we start zooming in at the production specifically for soybeans. I brought this just to show the importance that GMO and non-GMO, the relation between both, they have been setting up in the last couple of years. And this will make a lot of sense because this was one of the main developments for the production, especially in the land use in Brazil. So we have seen an extension of agriculture, especially from Mato Grosso. I don't have the laser point right now, but basically the yellow is pasture and agriculture and pasture is yellowy, and it's extending for areas what they called the Cerrado or savanna in Brazil. And that was mainly due to research and improvements in productivity yields, especially due to seeds, and also fertilizers that possibilitate the production in these areas. And also looking into the shifts that have been happening within Brazil, the land use for agriculture above the 16-degree parallel, which I show here in the map, it's cut by the 16 here. And previously also here in the land use, when we look at the further northern states, it also shifted the production, where the main areas where production for these grains have been happening. So there was a steady increase of production above the 16th parallel, and that also led to a change in logistics and challenges that Brazil faces today. Looking at traditional routes for the exports, when we talk about grains, remembering that I mentioned that grains go to the ports, and with the same trucks, the same railroads, they bring back the fertilizers. So it's the same logistics for fertilizers, just on the opposite flow. The traditional route from Sorriso, Mato Grosso, which is in red, right up above, and Santos, the port right down here on the left side corner, is around 27 to 30 hours by truck in roads that not necessarily are pavimented. There are maybe in some routes there's still terrain, it suffers a lot of flooding, it has a lot of space to grow in terms of infrastructure for logistics in Brazil. And with the shift in production above the 16th parallel, there has been a shift also in these exports and opportunities for logistics, as we see when we talk about the Northern Arc. I don't know if many of you have heard of this region, but it's a logistical shift that has been happening in Brazil, which basically consists in exporting grains and also bringing fertilizers through the northern ports, where sometimes are closer to importing regions, such as Europe, as an example. So it is significantly more advantageous for some producers. If we still talk about Sorriso as a base of comparison, it is way closer. It gains 5 hours, an example, and in terms of cost, which are also a challenge this year, especially with the international scenario that has been increasing steadily in fuels, it provides some advantages and opportunities for the sector to look at these alternative routes. So talking specifically about Sorriso, Santarém, which is also signaled up ahead. So in that sense, when we talk about the shift in production and exports, we also see these numbers impacting also the fertilizer sector. We went from 5.6 million to 8.1 million in just a couple of years. So these also, these exports have also presented themselves with opportunities for the fertilizers sectors to also improve and try to mitigate some logistic challenges that still are under a lot of discussion in Brazil. Basically because Brazil is increasing steadily year on year its production and exports. For the last 5 years, an example, planted area has increased 2.5 to 5% per year in terms just of grains, and necessarily in exponentially its production, but it wouldn't be possible without the further consumption of fertilizers, which increased significantly. When we look at the consumption by crop, soybeans represent almost 50% of fertilizers consumption in Brazil, and also that shift has also happened with the safrinha or winter corn crop, because Brazil is basically one of the countries that is able to do 2 harvests, one after another, based on these developments that we mentioned in research for seeds and also fertilizer applications due to monitoring rains, and also research that has been decreasing the time that the soybean and the corn they need to mature to be exported. So Brazil has been increasing its presence internationally due to this competitive and this research that has been happening in the agriculture area. So that is why also soybean and corn, they represent over 60%, almost 70% in some years of the consumption for fertilizers. Which also leads to another domestic challenge. I've been talking a lot about logistics, and mainly when we look at the challenges, logistics is key because as of 2021, Brazil imported most of its fertilizer consumption, 98% dependent on imports for potash, 94% dependent on nitrogen as a whole, and also around 80% dependent for phosphates in 21. So it's the fourth largest consumer in the world, but it's also heavily dependent on imports. On the contrary of what we look when we look at China, United States, and India, where they also have some national capacity that can surplus and supply more than 10% as an example. And also, as I mentioned, when I talked about the flows, we are heavily also dependent on fertilizer importers to some countries that we export a lot of grains to. So it's also, it puts into perspective that the international geopolitics doesn't impact mostly directly Brazil, but definitely indirectly it does. So what has been happening in Europe in the last year has also impacted and further put some weight into the challenges that Brazil already was facing. So just to give perspective what I was mentioning, from 2011, I would say we have increased, since 27, we have increased almost in 50%, almost more than 50% of our fertilizer consumption. Considering the last 5 years, we have more than 10 million metric tons more in consumption. So it also makes it necessary that Brazil has a certain agility to react to and adapt to these geopolitical shifts that has been happening, as we know. And also, it's very important to note that Brazil has a different profile in consumption for fertilizers when we look at the other countries that I have mentioned. Comparing to China, India, and the United States, which are heavily consuming N, due to agronomical standards and also the soil composition in Brazil, also the importance that soybean has in our domestic grain production. Brazil is heavily consuming P and K, so it puts Brazil into a spotlight also when we are talking about the P and K market and the challenges going forward. With that, some challenges and opportunities I have mentioned, mostly when we talk about the fertilizers market. High dependency on fertilizer imports is definitely a point going forward. And it definitely puts Brazil in the spotlight when we talk about the fertilizers market future from 23 onwards, and all the logistical and geopolitics that we are going to face going forward. International energy costs that in Brazil, when we talk about the whole supply chain, mostly has been impacting severely costs for roads and also maritime freights as an example. Also, investments in ports and roads in Brazil infrastructure to receive and be able to adapt to this ever-changing market. As I mentioned, in less than 5 years, consumption of fertilizers has more than increased 10 million tons. And we know that investments in ports and infrastructure is a long-term situation. So these are still points that are going to be in the highlight going forward. We also had a port waiting time challenge where our port capacity is still stagnant, as I have mentioned, whereas exports and imports have heavily increased during the pandemic. So this is definitely a challenge going forward. And Brazil is also an important food producer. So basically, all that has happened during the supply chain, not necessarily, it also involves challenges for Brazil as a food exporter, but also as an importer. So Brazil has these challenges right now to see necessarily what lies ahead, and it's really connected to what we have been discussing with Africa, what we have been discussing about Europe as well, because it's all very connected, remembering that Brazil not only is very intensive in agriculture, but is very intensive in feedstock and meat production to feed the world. So this is also a challenge that needs to be met. It has been mentioned here before, worldwide. So bringing these challenges that are much the same that Africa has in the long term and that Europe has also, because everything is basically connected and impacting, even if indirectly, the whole food chain system. And that was what I was going to bring to you today. Thank you very much for the invite and participation.